Hello, everyone. I just wanted to say some few things about Ross's value pluralism. I guess it's called value pluralism um, because he's a pluralist when it comes to value, moral value, or things not things that have value, things that have intrinsic value, things that are intrinsically good. Meaning, there's more than one thing. It's a plurality of things, a limited plurality, but a plurality. I guess one of the ways you can read this as the beginning of it is being anti-utilitarian, at least in the sense that if to be a utilitarian, say Bentham, is to think that the only thing that's intrinsically good is pleasure or the avoidance of pain, then Ross means to refute that can't be right. Of course, he goes on to say that pleasure is an intrinsic good. It's just not the only one. And I think it's quite interesting if we look to his list of things that are good, things that are intrinsically good. The first one, he says, is the first thing for which I would claim that it is intrinsically good is virtuous disposition and action. That is, action or disposition to act from any of certain motives, of which at all events the most notable are the desire to do one's duty, the desire to bring into being something that is good, and the desire to give pleasure or save pain to others. That should sound familiar. I'm not saying it's exactly what Kant said, but it's pretty close. If we remember that in the beginning of the Kant reading, he says that the only thing that's good in itself is a good will. The disposition to act from one's duty sounds pretty close to the Kantian idea of the good will. So, is Ross a Kantian? I don't know enough about Ross's work to say that he's a Kantian, but there's definitely a Kant influence here. So that's the first thing that he's saying is that if utilitarians say that the only thing that's intrinsically good is human pleasure, then that couldn't possibly be right. And his quick way of trying to establish that is in the second column, when he asks us to imagine a world with equal amounts of pleasure, but one of them in which people act from virtuous disposition and another one in which people don't. And he said we would clearly prefer the former over the latter, that we would prefer, all things being equal in terms of pleasure, we would consider it a better universe if it were filled with what he calls virtuous persons. This sort of thought experiment of which universe we would prefer is repeated, as you know, throughout the essay, different ways. The second thing that he argues is that pleasure is the good. That is, pleasure is a good, not the good. And to anybody who would deny that, and in this, I suppose that he's arguing against Kant, or he's arguing something which is not compatible with Kant. And the first thing he does is I think, is to suggest the same sort of thought experiment. Some will perhaps be helped to realize this if they make the corresponding supposition to that we have just made. If they suppose two states of the universe, including equal amounts of virtue, but the one including also widespread and intense pleasure and the other widespread and intense pain, obviously we would prefer the former. So we must think that pleasure is a good, that it adds to the general goodness of something, and that it does have intrinsic value, therefore.